Well, without further ado, welcome to Student Partnerships in Open Education, Addressing Power Dynamics and Belonging in STEM Teaching. I am here just to remind you that the conference code of conduct is in play for this session. We are recording for on behalf of our in perpetuity and for our colleagues who are joining via Zoom. And I'm going to turn things over to our speakers at this point to introduce themselves and get underway.
All right, thank you. Glenda, go ahead. You can start introductions.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. It's wonderful to be here, even though online. This presentation today is a wonderful collaboration between the University of Cape Town and Worcester Polytechnic Institute. And it's a teamwork process that has been going on for over a year now. And it started at the beginning of last year when Sarah Stanlick and I met, and we started to realize we had these amazing synergies and were feeling very strongly about the same kinds of principles. And you can move on. You will meet members of the team as we go on, and we don't really have a lot of time, so I'm not going to get into too much detail. As each presenter comes up, you can just kind of say who you are. But we saw that there was this values alignment around, especially around social justice issues and thinking about institutional transformation. And we realized there were three pillars that were driving both the UCT imperatives and the Worcester Polytechnic Institution imperatives. And these were issues around representation, the fact that there are groups that are traditionally underrepresented. We wanted to build around the idea of co-creation, so co-creation between us as colleagues, but very importantly, co-creation with students, and look at the power differentials and dynamics around co-creation. And then also we were driven and motivated by this idea of cost and accessibility of STEM textbooks and learning materials, and the cost being very expensive and not always accessible. So this is kind of what drove us, this idea of how we could use OER and open textbooks and open education resources to kind of diffuse the power dynamic through co-creation. Okay, you can do the next slide. And in the background, when we started to explore these areas, there is a lot of literature that has been written around students as partners. And if you're interested, you will find that it has been theorized and thought about very deeply for at least a decade. And there is an international journal for students as partners and various other journals where researchers have gone into this idea of co-creation with students. And it's shaped by principles of trust and respect and reciprocity and shared responsibility, which are the kind of pillars that we're aiming for. And we're looking at this idea of giving students more agency and disrupting traditional power dynamics, and giving students voice and helping students to value their identity through these co-creation and partnership projects. And then also what we find with the student participation is that this can lead to wider institutional transformation. And then, of course, students as partners in and of itself is wonderful and powerful, but when you add the open textbook, you give students this wonderful power of publication, which they really appreciate, and this kind of recognition that comes from this that can build towards a sense of belonging in higher education. Yeah. And then very briefly tying this into STEM education specifically, where we see that there have been communities that have been marginalized and unrecognized, both in the past, but currently, that this is an issue that needs to be brought to the forefront and addressed. And also that open materials in and of themselves do not necessarily solve this problem. It needs to be combined with thinking about social justice and co-creation. And so this is what we've been doing. Thank you. This is a slide from the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa at the time of student protests that went across higher education. You can show the next slide. And these protests were called the Fallist movements, and they began in 2015. And they called for the decolonization of higher education and the provision of free education. And this was a powerful student movement that really showed how powerful students are when they decide that they want to change the way things have been done. And, you know, even though this has happened, we're still working towards transformation. It's sort of a long journey. But we are aware that higher education systems are still highly inequitable, and that there is still this legacy and history of inequity. And especially in STEM disciplines in our context in South Africa, but perhaps also more globally, where they're funded traditionally for kind of with male-dominated and traditionally white kind of field and discipline. So UCT has had a long journey with open education since around 2007. And then more recently, we've been building this scholarship around the relationship between open education and social justice, and how the open textbooks can overcome certain injustices around curriculum change. We can bring in multilingualism and access to education and inclusivity that hasn't been present in the past. And then this brings in this very interesting conversation that we're going to be exploring in this session around power imbalances and how students view power imbalances and how we can move forward. Next slide. I'm going to hand over to Michelle at this point.
Thanks, Glenda. Hi, everybody. I'm Michelle Willmers. I am the Publishing and Implementation Manager in the Digital Open Textbooks for Development Initiative with Glenda and Bianca. So the backdrop in which we're operating against, this is just a snapshot. In our national picture, we have a skills gap between school leavers and university entrants, but combined with this chronic skills shortages and high unemployment rates in South Africa, and indeed in the sub-Saharan continent, particularly in STEM fields, complex institutional transformation agendas, as Glenda's just referred to, addressing issues of costs and accessibility, but also epistemic representation and curriculum change. And the net result of it is students left in the middle of the picture feeling quite overwhelmed, particularly in our context, our institution is around 30,000 students and a highly diverse student body. We have 11 official South African languages and many students not receiving instruction in their first languages. Next slide, please. So the case that we wanted to share is the Science is Tough, But So Are You initiative in the science faculty at UCT. The aim of this initiative is to inspire students to take charge of their learning, to stay engaged and connect conceptual knowledge to their real life experiences. And we knew when we started this initiative, there were some tough topics we needed to broach. Things like culture shock, what it feels like to be Black at UCT at the moment, and student authorship, co-authorship provided us with the means to bring these lived realities into the resource and tackle the quite difficult things that we as older people, to be frank, and as academics weren't able to adequately address. The idea being that students are the experts in their lived environments. Next slide, please. So what these little blobs are, they're intended to represent touchstones. There's a bit of an ecosystem here, but they essentially want to demonstrate that students are involved in this process. We started out with writing workshops, but students became involved in a range of activities, and each of these touchstones provides an opportunity to, as Glenda said, diffuse power relations. Not necessarily subvert, but something interesting is happening. Also interesting to note that the positions are all voluntary and unpaid, and contribution results in co-authorship of a chapter, and there are student co-editors who are steering this whole process from a perspective. Next slide, please. This is just an example of some of the text and visual elements from the book, all of which have been co-created with students. You'll see a different mix. The specialist perspectives are academics at UCT writing. The My Stories are pieces of writing that came from writing workshops, and then we've had students contribute in every way. But really, as you can see, a strong focus on the lived experience. Next slide. To Bianca.
Thanks, Michelle. Hi, everyone. My name is Bianca Masuku, and I am part of the Digital Open Textbooks for Development team, and I work very closely with Glenda and Michelle, as has already been mentioned, at UCT. So what I wanted to talk about here is a little bit of the insights that we gathered from working with a couple of the collaborators from the initiative that Michelle has just described. So as part of the UCT team's research and implementation work, we conducted a series of interviews over the past year or so to interrogate and to better understand the experience of collaboration in open textbook development, with a particular focus on student participation in this work. Our interviews were both student and faculty focused, with a total of 5 interviews with open textbook authors and 11 interviews with student collaborators in open textbook initiatives, here with a particular focus on 3 from the Faculty of Science in the initiative Michelle has mentioned now. And these were all semi-structured interviews, and our questions were focused around a range of themes, such as injustices that were taking place in the classroom, understandings and experiences of power dynamics between students and academics, perceptions of belonging, the values and attitudes required for collaborative work, experiences of co-creation, and different ideas around recognition and reward for students when it comes to doing collaborative work. And so the Science is Tough initiative has been a very good, or has been a great example, actually, of the intricacies and complexities of collaborating with students in the production of teaching and learning resources, particularly in the sciences. And we wanted to share some insights here from 3 students, excuse me, from this particular initiative who were part of the core editorial team that we feel speak to partnership and power and to belonging. Next slide, please. And so we drew out 3 particular themes here to highlight some of their experiences. Firstly, students had varied perceptions of power dynamics in their process of collaboration and knowledge co-creation, with one student sharing that their experience was quite positive, right? But another highlighting that she struggled with authority figures and finding ways to speak up for herself in this collaboration. And another student saying that it's actually really hard to challenge these traditional lines of authority between students and lecturers, because it's really all they know. It's what it's a system they were brought up in as well, but they don't want that to be the norm going forward. So they're always trying to think of ways to kind of push back at these hierarchies in co-creation. Secondly, students touched on ideas of belonging by talking about their experiences of struggling with the sense of agency and navigating their own student voice in doing this kind of work. One student shared that they felt listened to in their work process, but mostly felt that they had to stay in their lane and didn't really feel empowered enough to offer their expertise in some instances because they were only given this one specific role to operate in. However, another student shared that their experience in this working team felt very safe and inclusive, and that it was their own imposter syndrome and their own uncertainties about their contributions that they had to navigate when they were doing this kind of work. So each student shared a different perspective of what belonging meant for them and what it felt like for them. And lastly, students were also asked about what they thought could be, we could move to the next slide, what they thought could be done to enable and to facilitate better collaboration practices between lecturers and students. And here they highlighted that for them, they felt like there was a need for more awareness building for both students and lecturers about open textbook production. And that there was a need to allow students to apply for these collaborative positions instead of having lecturers select key students that they felt they wanted to work with, because it felt very, very exclusionary in that sense. Another student highlighted that there was also a need to conduct different kinds of workshops about collaborative practices with both parties in order to start breaking down these hierarchies and better promote student voices by teaching everyone how to actually do this kind of work. And one particular insight that stood out for us from a student, from one of the students, stated that, I don't think the problem is how we can make it easier for students. I think the problem for me is how we can get more staff members to come down from their ivory towers to start being willing to work with students. And then they need to have the right values and ethos around how they're writing it. This whole I need to keep co-authorship for myself thing is so 1800s. And here the student is really highlighting the need to do the work of co-creation and share the power, particularly through publication, because of the impact that it can have on a student's educational journey and eventually on their career. So these insights here are just a real small snapshot of the ways in which students are thinking about and understanding partnership and how they're experiencing and navigating their roles as collaborators in these initiatives, while also, struggling and contending with issues around power and voice and belonging. So they acknowledge that they have an important role to play, an important perspective to contribute that can shape their educational experiences and their career trajectories in particular ways. And so they're recognizing partnership with their lecturers and also with their peers as this very powerful tool for them, and see it as a way in which they can participate, but also be very much included in their own educational journeys. Yeah. I'd like to hand over to our WPI team now, I think. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Courtney Kurlanska. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I work at an engineering school. So basically what I tell people is I teach engineers how to interact with humans. So today we're going to talk about some of the OER work that we have done at WPI. So prior to 2021, OER at WPI was very much an individualistic experience. There wasn't a whole lot of collaboration, and people were doing a lot of things, but nobody knew what it was. So in 21-22, we, myself and the team from WPI, we were part of the AAC&U Institute on OERs, and that's really what got the ball rolling at trying to implement OERs at a more structural level at WPI. We then continued this work. We had a peer learning community, that's the PLC. So we had a group of, we found other faculty who were interested in it. We did a year-long project where each person in that group worked on different components of OER to try and disseminate the importance of OER across the faculty. We also had a RIOS grant that was a foundational grant to support future research. And then we managed to get 2 grants from the Women's Impact Network, which is an organization at WPI to support faculty fellows. So what we actually did is we got a grant from them 2 years running to then give grants to faculty to create OERs. And we acted as mentors for those. So that's just kind of like a little background. We don't have the length of history that our colleagues have in South Africa, but we do, we've been working on it pretty intensely for the last few years. So today what we want to share with you is research in a couple of different areas. So we have 2 studies that we're going to talk about, or 2 incidents. One is the implementation of student co-creation in an animal behavior course. And so this study is student focused. The research around the use of OERs in this context is looking at and focusing on student belonging. It's in a biology course, and the research collected, the data collected was student reflections and surveys, and so this impacted 72 students. And we're also going to talk about the fellows program that we did with those mini grants, and we're going to try to understand how the faculty who had, for the most part, not used OERs in the past were experiencing this OER use, how we were able to scale OERs at our institute. And this is based on faculty reflections that they'd had at the end of that experience. And we had 14 fellows that we're going to draw from. Now I'm going to hand it off to Marja.
All right. Hi, everyone. I am Marja Bakermans. I am a wildlife ecologist. We're a mixed group of faculty and staff working together at WPI. I want to acknowledge Lori Ostapowicz-Critz and Anna Gold, who are librarians who are part of our group, who we can't do any of this work, whether it's in the class or these larger efforts without them as well. But so the first case I just wanted to share stems from this intermediate level animal behavior course. This was a course that I redesigned and that had a clear and intentional focus on centering diversity and inclusion. Of course, sort of a low-hanging fruit way to do that is to bring in materials that are more representative and recognize, diverse perspectives. But the materials that I brought and the activities we did also had very explicit discussions around how different identities and perspectives and experiences actually shape the discipline. It changes the research questions that are being asked. It changes, how the knowledge is being pushed forward in ways when it was, dominated by historically dominated by white male researchers, how it's completely changed this particular discipline, It's very specific to animal behavior. So you can see some of the sort of key sources that I use to start these discussions with students. We also practiced this throughout the course. Students had to audit different sources for their openness and inclusivity. And I give them some very stark different sources, like an open Wikipedia book around the history of animal behavior that does not mention a single woman, or person of color in the history of shaping this discipline. It's the students, it's laughable, to the students when they see this versus some other sources. And then through the course, the students eventually work in a team project and they are co-authoring based on the topic they choose and adding in, intentionally thinking through and adding in inclusive and open elements, and they get peer reviewed by another team with this sort of audit as well. So that's just a very brief summary. And at the end of the course, I surveyed students using the sense of social fit scale to understand their sense of belonging after the intervention of all of these steps and activities and discussions and so on. And there are 6 measures, but I included 3 here to demonstrate that I asked students on a Likert scale where they strongly disagreed to strongly agree, how they felt. Did they feel accepted in the course? And how does that compare to feeling accepted at the university? Did they feel included? Do they feel comfortable? Do they belong? Do they fit in? These kinds of things. And so the yellow tabs here indicate those students that strongly agreed. I just used that measure for this one. So 90% of the students in the course strongly agreed that they felt accepted in the course. And in the blue, the same student group, 52% said they strongly agree they felt accepted at the university. Okay, and so this was across all identities, and I asked students to self-identify across a number. And so we're taking a look across multiple genders, and our non-binary and transgender students, which we have a strong and growing population at WPI of students who identify as non-binary and transgender. These 3 groups. We've got included on the top, belonging in the middle, and comfort at the bottom. In each one, there are 2 bars. The lower bars represent their responses at the university scale. And you can see that non-binary and transgender students across all of the 6 measures reported the lowest sense of belonging at the university setting. But the top bars in each group demonstrate that if we implement, right, we know we have a lot of work to do at the university for students who come from marginalized identities and populations, and implementing some of these open and inclusive strategies in the course can demonstrate this shift where we are actually creating more welcoming, right, classrooms for these students. Also, there were some students completed a reflection at the end of the term. And so I've been doing a thematic analysis around some of their reflections. They were prompted to discuss, what does inclusive teaching and learning look like to you? How does that connect to STEM? Because 98% of these students are STEM majors. Very few are actually biology majors in this course. And how does that relate to STEM? How does that relate to the rest of your coursework? And how do you see this connecting to your career, right? These elements. And here are some of the key themes that really kind of bubbled up around the student quotes. But I just want to say that in general, students really connected to the social justice aspect, where they repeatedly reflected upon how open and inclusive sources and information is necessary to improve student learning, to reduce bias, to reduce barriers, to empower students. And just like Bianca said, they really feel like gatekeeping of knowledge is ridiculous, and they want no part of that, and they want to be able to share their information and knowledge with the larger learning community. And I'm going to pass it over to Sarah now.
Hey, thank you so much, Marja. I'm Sarah Stanlick. I'm a faculty member, obviously, at WPI in our Global and Integrative Studies department, as well as the director of our first year seminar program, which is a project-based interdisciplinary opportunity for students to do project-based learning from the very start of their WPI experience. And so seeing the gamut of student experiences and the amount of opportunity for students to learn from our faculty who are bringing in their personal experiences and have a real focus towards social justice and inclusion in their work, that came through really nicely in our fellowship program. And so as Courtney mentioned, we had faculty fellows over the last 2 years, 14 in total, who came from a variety of different disciplines. So Spanish language, biology, mechanical engineering, mathematics, just to name a few. Who are working on specific artifacts over their time in the fellowship program that would then be published, sometimes co-authored with students, definitely in dialogue with students, and a few of them being very, very explicit about trying to get student authorship in the resources that they were creating. And some were undergraduate students and some grad students. But what we wanted to hear was from the faculty, what was their experience? What did they gain in terms of learning and understanding over this time period? And then what they kind of envisioned for the future. And when we asked them to do a reflection, we didn't give them specific prompts to answer to. It was really just asking, how did your experience go? What reflections, what learnings did you take from it? And when we did a grounded theory analysis, much like Marja has been doing the thematic analysis with her student examples, similar themes emerged. And so faculty talked about the demand for skilled CAD modelers, but the inability to really connect learning resources that don't have, that the resources are inaccessible, there's not good content alignment, there's underrepresentation of women and minoritized identities in those CAD models and tutorials. So their project was really intended upon creating those resources and working directly with a student to be able to create those modules and have the student as the face of the modules, who was a woman in that department. We also heard faculty reflections on student agency, thinking about authorship opportunities for undergraduates who oftentimes don't see themselves as scholars, or they don't see themselves rising to the level of being publishable. One team from the biology department was very hands-on with the students in creating some of those artifacts and journal articles to be published, considered, reviewed, and then successfully placed in journals. Co-creation was another piece that we heard loud and clear in their reflections about thinking even the faculty understanding of themselves as shifting as facilitator rather than lecturer, or the power hierarchy that we've talked about throughout this presentation, but really setting the students up to be authentic authors and to realizing the mentorship and advisory role of faculty members. Cost and accessibility also was something that came out through the reflections. In terms of offsetting existing disparities and access to publishable research, both things that you would consume and then also things that you would create. Because when you think about the barrier to entry with some of the different journals and the pricing that might also go along with that, if you wanted to publish open access, sometimes there are costs that are associated. And so thinking about how to mitigate those and ease the barrier to entry for people who might not have been resourced otherwise. And then finally, a general social justice focus was thinking about the many pieces of accessible learning materials and simultaneously promoting inclusivity in those kind of subverting the gender norms within specific fields. So we had a lot of faculty who spoke to this without us guiding them, which I think spoke really to both their commitment to inclusivity and social justice in the experience, but then also what they learned from each other as peers and through the process. Next slide, please, Marja. All right, so as Bianca mentioned,
3 minutes, Sarah.
all right, thank you. Bianca mentioned, terrific quote. And just to highlight this, is moving past that traditional conception of authorship, and then also past that egotistical, individual-centric authorship that's often entrenched in things like our tenure and promotion systems. So hopefully, not only for us, but also modeling for the students that there is a different way of being. Next slide, Marja. Okay, so a few takeaways. Context and culture is very important, an important part of developing a strategy. I think you've heard that in both of our contexts, both in terms of history and political cultural, but then also in terms of the disciplinary and historical. Our approaches are adaptable, but then what can we be taken away from those very different cases? While there is context across discipline that matters, there are transferable learnings that can be shared. The UCT students had struggles overcoming some of the power hierarchies. So thinking about more collaborative workshops and ways to scaffold those experiences for development in the students. UCT also had clear views about voice and injustice. I think that is something that maybe WPI students, there is a thread, but it's not necessarily as entrenched in maybe some of our students' lived history. So that's an interesting comparison to think about. And then WPI students with minoritized identities are seeking representation and inclusion in STEM fields dominated by majoritized populations. So whether they are thinking that way because of their political historical knowledge, regardless of that backing or that experience, they're still facing it kind of directly on both with their materials that they're working with and by looking around the classes that they're in as well. And so we're working to seek more epistemic justice and more inclusion for those students. Next slide, please, Marja. So we offer it to you some questions for reflection and thinking about your own practice. How open are you specifically to student co-authorship and collaboration? How might you introduce more opportunities for student co-authorship in your teaching and research? Are there ways that you can dip your toe in and try new things to work with students? Any mechanisms at your institution that can help support student creation and co-authorship? Are there things like your teaching and learning centers that might offer some funding to be able to do small professional learning communities, or opportunities maybe to gather folks together under the auspices of an external, such as the AAC&U Institute that we talked about? And then finally, what are some of the groundwork needs that you have and that you need to do to create a culture of students as colleagues at your institution? It's not just about necessarily providing the resources, but there are cultural norms, there's time, there are all different types of pressures that sometimes subvert the opportunity to have that power dynamic to be diffuse. So These are just a few things maybe to take away for you to consider as you're moving forward in your work. And then a few lists, links of interests and more resources. We'll put these in the chat as well. The International Journal for Students as Partners, our two institutional contexts, a paper that we wrote through WPI and through that Rios grant we mentioned. And then the UCT team has published so much. So you just need to peek at any of their names on Google Scholar and you'll see pages of excellent work. So thank you so much. I'll give it back to Marja at the podium.
Thank you. We want to thank everyone for joining today. Our folks online will stay online to answer questions, and Courtney and I are here for anyone in person. We can always talk later. So thank you.